All right, are you ready for this? We're tackling Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens today.
Yeah, talk about a deep dive, huh? This book is dense.
You said it. Condensing the whole history of humankind. And for what? To try and understand these big turning points, right? The cognitive revolution, the agricultural revolution, then later on, the scientific revolution.
And Harari doesn't even start with, history. He throws you way back, millions of years before writing even existed.
Right. Before any of what we usually think of as history, it's like picture humans as just another animal.
Another creature trying to make a living, part of the landscape, but not necessarily the ones in charge.
And it's humbling in a way to think that 2.5 million years ago, give or take, those early humans, they weren't that different from us physically.
Same basic hardware, looking at the world with pretty much the same kind of brain.
Uh-huh.
Or were they? Because then, bam, roughly 70,000 years ago, the cognitive revelation hits the scene.
It's like Sapiens went from 0 to 60 in evolutionary terms.
It really makes you wonder what flipped the switch. What happened? Harari throws out a few ideas, but the one that always gets me is fire.
And not just fire as in, ooh, stay warm, nice campfire, but like control of fire. Think about what cooking does.
Cooking, it's huge, right? We always hear about cooked food leading to bigger brains.
Which is already mind-blowing, but it's even more than that. It's like suddenly you need to chew less, you get more nutrients from the same plants.
Exactly. We weren't just adapting to the environment anymore. We started shaping it to make ourselves better.
Total game changer. And that, I think, is where the bigger brains come in. It wasn't just the food itself, but the ability to free up energy.
Totally. Harari talks about this energy trade-off between our guts and our brains. Both are super energy hungry.
So you cook food, shorter digestion, bam, more juice for the brain to work with.
And that leads to language, to more complex thought, to everything that makes us human.
Which leads to another kind of power. Sharing what we know. It's like cooking wasn't just about physical evolution. It's like it kicked off this whole other reality, the reality of ideas.
Exactly. We're not just living in the physical world anymore, the trees, the rivers, the stuff we can touch, but also in this world we imagine.
In this world of... what? Give me an example.
Think about it. Nations, corporations, money. None of that is physically real in the same way a mountain is real.
But man, it sure feels real when you get your paycheck or when there's a war going on, right? That stuff controls our lives.
And Harari's point is, the imagined stuff is now even calling the shots about the physical world. Like a corporation can decide the fate of an entire forest.
Even though a forest is, actual trees, it's wild. So how did we get from cooking to board meetings that determine if a forest lives or dies?
Harari says it's the cognitive revolution. Specifically language, that was the key. It let us create these incredibly complex myths.
Myths meaning stories, not necessarily in a fake way, but...
Exactly. Stories that can unite huge groups of people. Stories that built empires, started wars, created entire legal systems. These shared narratives, even if they're about things that don't physically exist, that's the bedrock of so much of what we take for granted.
So a story can be more powerful than a spear, in a way.
Sometimes, yeah. And it's not all theoretical. Think about that archaeological site, Sungir, in Russia. We're talking 30,000 years ago.
So, Ice Age, mammoths, not exactly building iPhones back then. What's at Sungir?
They find this grave, right?
Yeah.
One dude decked out in 3,000 ivory beads, a hat trimmed with fox teeth, bracelets on bracelets.
3,000? How long does it even take to make one bead out of ivory? This guy was important.
Exactly. And meanwhile, other graves from the same time period, barely anything in them. So you have to wonder, what made this guy so special?
A chief, a shaman, but clearly 3,000 beads worth of special.
Right. Shows there was hierarchy, specialized skills, and then there's another Sungir tomb that's even more wild.
Okay, hit me with it.
It's two children buried head to head, covered in, get this, 10,000 ivory beads.
10,000. Each one representing hours of work, someone's skilled hands. What does that say about what they believed back then?
To me, it says those weren't just cavemen, as we imagine them. Complex rituals, a belief system that put immense value on those kids.
And those beads, that's not just survival anymore. That's something more. It makes you think twice about calling any society primitive, right?
Absolutely. They had a whole system of meaning we're just getting glimpses of.
Yeah.
But all this power we gained, this ability to cooperate, to tell these big stories, it's a double-edged sword.
You're saying it wasn't all sunshine and building awesome bead-covered tombs?
Not exactly. Early sapiens, they were already changing the world around them, sometimes not in a good way.
Go on.
Well, take the extinction of the megafauna in Australia. Giant kangaroos, wombats the size of cars. Gone. And guess who was on the scene when they vanished?
It's like a whole lost world, just gone. Makes you realize we weren't just another animal. We are a force of nature, in a way, capable of incredible destruction, too.
And that brings us to the next big turning point Harari talks about, the agricultural revolution. Which, we think farming, that's good, right? But it was more complicated than that.
It's not just about planting seeds, it's about a whole new way of life, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we'll get into why that might not have been such a great deal for everyone involved when we come back.
So we've got these powerful brains reshaping the planet, but Harari, he doesn't stop there. He takes us right to the edge of our own mortality with this whole Gilgamesh project idea.
It's wild, right? This obsession with immortality, it pops up everywhere you look in human history. Myths, legends, stories.
Yeah. Like every culture has some version of a quest for eternal life. But it's only recently we've actually started to believe we could, actually win that game.
Exactly. Death went from being this fact of life, this inevitable thing, to a problem to be solved.
A bug to be fixed.
That's a great way to put it. And that's what the Gilgamesh Project is all about. It's very human drive to cheat death, to transcend our limits.
And Harari takes us through all the ways we've tried to do that, from drinking weird potions to
uploading our minds into computers. Who knows?
Yeah.
It's a wild ride.
Speaking of wild rides, the advances in medicine, even just in the last century, those have been kind of mind-blowing, right?
Totally. I mean, living past 50 used to be a pretty good run for a lot of people. Now we're talking 80, 90, 100 is the new goalpost for some folks.
Yeah. It really makes you wonder, what's next? If we could actually hack aging, push it out indefinitely.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
Because sure, living longer sounds great in theory, but
what happens to everything else? Would life even feel the same if you take death off the table?
it's a question we might have to deal with sooner than we think. And that's what I appreciate about Harari. He's not just telling us what happened, he's making us think about what might happen.
It's like a history book that's also a sneak peek into the future.
Exactly. And speaking of the future, that brings us to another big one. Artificial intelligence. And I'm not talking about robots taking our jobs. This is bigger than that.
Okay, so not just robots making our coffee. What then?
Harari wants us to imagine AI as a new form of intelligence, one that could potentially surpass our own.
Surpass. Yeah, so not just doing what we tell them to do, but...
Thinking for themselves, maybe in ways we can't even comprehend right now.
Okay, now that's both exciting and more than a little terrifying. I mean, we're already seeing AI doing incredible things, stuff we never thought possible just a few years ago.
Right. So then the question becomes, what happens if we create something that's smarter than us?
Smarter, stronger. Are we creating our own successors? Is that what's going on here?
Harari doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but he raises some really important questions. Questions about control, about ethics.
Because if you create something that's potentially more powerful than you are, well, you better hope it still likes you, right?
Exactly. And that's what's so fascinating about looking at AI through the lens of history.
You mean like thinking about those early humans with their fire? Could they even imagine a world with, like, computers and stuff?
Probably not. And here we are, doing the same thing, pushing the boundaries of what's possible. Who knows what we'll create, for better or worse?
It's humbling in a weird way.
It really puts our place in the grand scheme of things into perspective. And it all comes back to that fundamental question that I think runs through all of Sapiens. What's the point? What does it all mean?
It's the question, right? Especially now, with everything changing so fast, the future feels, I don't know, exciting and scary at the same time.
Exactly. So, does Harari offer any answers? Well, not in a here's the meaning of life kind of way. But he does offer a perspective that I find really helpful. He suggests that meaning isn't something out there waiting to be found. It's something we create through the stories we tell, the values we live by, the connections we make.
So even in this crazy, unpredictable world, we still have agency. We get to decide what matters.
That's empowering.
Mm-hmm.
And it speaks to what makes Sapiens such a great book. It's not just about the past. It's about understanding our place in the present and making choices about the future.
It's funny, right? We're talking about reshaping the planet, like literally controlling nature. We're talking about maybe someday outsmarting death itself.
Living in a computer simulation, who knows? Anything's possible, right?
But then there's this other thing, this really basic thing that Harari keeps coming back to, happiness. Like, after all this progress, Are we actually any happier?
It's the big question, isn't it?
Hmm.
You'd think all this advancement would equal happier lives, but
Mm.
does it do it?
Well, I mean, I've got a smartphone. I can order takeout from my couch.
Right. But then Harari throws you a curveball, like the agricultural revolution. We think farming, that's good, progress. But he makes a really good case that it might have been the opposite for individuals.
Wait, really? Explain that.
Think about it. Longer hours, new diseases, less varied diets compared to those hunter-gatherer ancestors.
Mm.
Were we better off?
So, like, more stuff, more control, but maybe not happier.
Maybe not. And to make things even more complicated, he brings in science.
Science? What, like lab coats and test tubes? Now we're talking about happiness?
Yeah. Turns out biologists and psychologists, they're studying happiness now, like what's actually going on in our brains.
So it's not just like a philosophy question anymore.
Not at all. And one of the big things they're finding is a lot of our happiness, it's linked to brain chemistry, not external stuff.
Get at it. So you're saying, like, even if I won the lottery tomorrow, my brain might still be like, yeah.
It's possible. There's a baseline level of well-being that seems to be, in part, just how our brains are wired.
Huh. So what were we supposed to do with that if some of this happiness stuff is just built in?
Well, it's not the whole story.
Okay.
But I think what Harari's getting at is maybe the next frontier isn't just outward, flying to Mars, inventing new gadgets.
It's inward, like figuring out our own minds.
Exactly. And this is where he brings it back to stories. We're hardwired for meaning, for purpose, and throughout history, religion has been the master storyteller.
Giving us that bigger picture, right? The good, the bad, the why we're here.
Exactly. And Harari defines religion really broadly. Not just gods and scriptures, but any system of values based on a superhuman order.
So, like, communism counts. Capitalism.
Even nationalism. They all provide these big, overarching stories that tell us what's right, what's wrong, how we fit in.
So even if you think you're being totally rational, you're still buying into some kind of story. We can't escape it.
And that's powerful, because it means we have a choice in which stories we follow, which ones we choose to build our lives around.
Which brings us to, well, right now, what stories are we going to tell ourselves going forward?
That's the challenge, isn't it? With all these huge changes happening, AI, climate change, what values will guide us? What kind of future will we imagine into being?
That's a lot to think about.
It is. But that's what makes Sapiens such a mind-blowing read. It's not just a history lesson. It's a framework for understanding who we are, where we've been, and where we might go next.
And to our listener who recommended this book.
Yeah. Hopefully this deep dive gave you a lot to chew on.
Because Harari doesn't give you all the answers, but he makes you ask some really, really good questions.
And that's just the beginning, right?
The conversation continues. Thanks for listening.